All right, so we're probably going to kick things off here to get started. Um, Thank you all so much for joining the Google session implications for digital marketing in a cookieless world. I know we're all excited for this content from Stephen Yap. Before we get started, I just want to share a few housekeeping notes for those of you that weren't in this morning's session or this is your first of the connection. This session will be recorded. We'll post the recordings to all attendees post the connection. Um, all attendees are on mute and off camera, so don't worry about any background noise. You should be good to go. While the video is going, please feel free to interact, ask questions, specifically in the Whova app in that Q&A section. We'll be monitoring that and answering questions at the end, but definitely engage with us. We'd love to hear your ideas and thoughts and questions throughout. We'll be monitoring that for you. Any help that's needed throughout the conference, sound or connection issues, you can email marketing@carnegiehighered.com. You can also use the Ask Organizers Anything section of the community board in Whova. Finally, we do encourage you to be social as much as possible. We have the hashtag the connection that you can leverage, and then you can also tag at Carnegie HQ. And with that, I'm really excited to introduce Stephen Yap and kick it over to him to get started.
Awesome. Thank you, Jamie. Can you hear me? Are we good? I think we're all
You
set.
sound great.
Awesome. Well, first off, thank you for having me. Hello, everyone. My name is Stephen Yap, and I've been asked to have the privilege of speaking with you all today. So first and foremost, would like to thank Carnegie for actually inviting me to come here and talk about a subject that honestly preoccupies my day most days, but one I think that is often misunderstood and not really well known, and that is kind of the digital marketing ecosystem, how it's been evolving, and its current evolution with the redaction of third-party cookies. So my hope today is that you'll be able to walk away with more or even a better understanding of what and how this ecosystem is changing. And then most importantly, how you can begin your own journey of transformation within your institution. And then, of course, leveraging partners like Carnegie in your journey. I know we have a bunch of institutions on the call. I don't want to play favorites. Go Eagles. I'm a Boston College guy. And so with that, all right. So let's just, I'm going to level set in a couple different ways, and forgive me for that. I know that like the spectrum of knowledge is pretty vast out there, and even in my own industry, there are people who've been in my industry for over a decade who still don't really understand a lot of the nomenclature. I've been doing this for 2 decades, and I don't know all of it, right? And it's constantly moving and changing. But I've been in the ad technology and marketing technology space for over 2 decades. I've occupied a number of different jobs in sales. And so when I started, I joined the ad tech leader, DoubleClick, back in 2000, was there for about 5 years. Then joined a website analytics firm, Omniture. Some of you may be familiar with that, for just over a year to run their global channel programs before coming back to DoubleClick to run the sales for North America. We actually were acquired by Google a few years after that, and that's really when I started to kind of get into the guts of like cookies and what that means, and basically the makeup of the ecosystem. I went on to found, I was one of the co-founders of our enterprise analytics product, Google Analytics 360. So me and my team actually wrote the business plan and basically took that to market, and then ran and commercialized a bunch of the data solutions for Google throughout the next 8 years. Most recently, I was running the retail divisions for our technology business. So just helping retailers kind of on their digital marketing journeys. And then most recently in January, I was promoted into the head of the Americas for the technology division for Google. So I've had a bunch of experience, but that is not to be like, ooh, a lot of experience. It's more like, look, if I still don't get a lot of this because it is confusing, it's overly complex, then it should just basically hope to illustrate that this is complicated, it's ever changing, but it also, it makes it really exciting. All right, So to understand the complexity, and again, trust me, we're not going to go too deep. Um, Trying to touch on everyone's knowledge. So I just want to take you through kind of how this whole industry came about, right? And so at the start was DoubleClick, right? Back in 1996. DoubleClick was actually a media-based company. And what they were asked to do by a lot of their clients on the media side was, hey, can you provide a technology solution that would allow a publisher, so think New York Times.com, to manage all of their inventory and ad assets from a single UI. So to be able to accept orders, to be able to execute orders, to be able to traffic campaigns, that had not been done up until that point, right? Like a lot of it was very analog, right? Very, very fax, right? You're faxing freaking IOs in there. So it's heavy, very paper heavy, incredibly inefficient. So DoubleClick created this technology. They also then, shortly thereafter, received kind of feedback from advertiser saying, hey, we want the same thing. So if I'm Target and I want to advertise on CNN, New York Post, New York Times, the Boston Globe, Boston Herald, I want to be able to do that in one single user interface. And I want to be able to traffic all of my creative assets over to the publishers, but at the same time get the reporting back. And so that's where our ad server Dart for advertisers actually was born, right? And so you had the mid 90s, all of this stuff was happening. During that time, a small little search company by the name of Google was actually starting to kind of gain some real momentum within the marketplace. Shortly thereafter, in 2005, they bought a company called Urchin, site analytics firm. DoubleClick went on to get bought by Google as these two paths started to converge. Then it actually started to buy additional technology, right? And this is kind of where the creation of the ad ecosystem or the ad technology ecosystem began. So we bought Terracent, which was a data and rich media company. We bought Invite Media, which was our foray into programmatic. Again, I'll talk a little bit about that. And then we rebranded a bunch of times because we're Google and we like to change the names a lot. At the same time, in 2010, I have to talk to marketing, the slides are on. I founded Google Analytics Premium, which then became GA360. Ultimately, these came into this giant thing and the birth of what we call Google Marketing Platform, which is what I am currently responsible for. So without boring everyone too much, and it's not a sales pitch, but it was designed to kind of make delivery of ad campaigns easier, efficient, and effective, right? Like, can your dollar go further? I will simply tell you, by doing all of this, we are a single company in a huge industry. And so how big is the industry? Because it often is not talked about that much, unless obviously we're getting, we're in the news for other reasons. The ad tech business is roughly about $750 billion today, right? It's expected to actually reach in terms of total revenue about 2.9 trillion in the next 15 years. So it is a huge component of advertising. And obviously, since digital is so prevalent within the world, it is actually a big part of that. So now that we have scale, so you all know how big this is, right? Like this is an industry and it's massive, right? It is one of the driving forces of advertising. So let's see who makes up this ecosystem and more importantly, how it works. Now, disclaimer number one, right? You'll get a bunch of them throughout my discussion here. We can spend hours in this because there are too many nuances to speak about. Again, what is bought and sold, how it's bought and sold, the different varying technologies. I'll dive into that and give you a little bit of a visual. But honestly, like I'm trying to provide just a general overview, right? So when we talk about what is bought and sold, these are all the things that you are familiar with on the right? Search, content, right? Things like New York Times, emails, commerce, social, apps, video. All of them have surface areas and what we like to refer to as inventory that then can be purchased, right? For consumers to be served. So I'm reading an article in the New York Times, Target ad pops up. I'm looking at the Target ad, maybe click on it, maybe act on it. But that is generally what is bought and sold in a digital ecosystem. There's also how it's bought and sold, right? And so there's either varying technologies or varying buying practices that you may have. Programmatic was one of them. You're going to hear that a lot, especially if you're circulating around the ad ecosystem. If you think about programmatic, you should think about kind of like financial trading, right? There are ad exchanges on the publisher side, right? So this is an exchange that has a bunch of different advertising inside of it. And then you have bidders or DSPs that can then go in and bid on that advertising. This was actually a revolutionary thing, programmatic, because before it was all bought and sold on a reservation basis, right? I'd go, Jamie, I'd say, Jamie, I want these units for this amount of time. She'd be like, great, here's the cost. We'd negotiate, and it would be done. I'd shoot it through the systems. Here, the reason why it was so revolutionary is that it made it a lot more efficient in terms of how it was transacted. Because what you could do is you could overlay data, right? Cookie-based data and what we knew about the behaviors of those online into the bidding algorithm. So if I was an advertiser like Target, I can go into my bidder and say, look, I want males 25 to 54, household incomes of 150K plus, who are interested in dogs and kites, right? And then go out and find me those people. And so it would go in there and it would find inventory in the exchange, and then it would bid on it. And you'd be able to say, I want to bid up to this amount, or I want to bid in between these. The most efficient thing about it, which was in the old days, the publishers would be like, all right, that's a $50 CPM. But then you get mad because you'd learn like he sold it for $20 to the person before you, right? In the exchange, it would only provide the price that the market will bear. So what does that mean? Well, that means that if Jamie bid 50, but the next highest bid next to hers was 20, then Jamie got it for $20.01, right? So it would literally pull it down because it wouldn't artificially inflate marketplaces. So we knew then the true value of that. But having the data overlaid on all of these buys made it incredibly efficient and very, very effective. There are two parties generally. There actually are three, but let's leave the consumer out of this one. There are two parties primarily within the ecosystem, right? We split them up in something very simply called the buy side and the sell side. We're not that creative in our industry. Buy side means that you're buying stuff. Sell side means you're selling stuff. It's pretty straightforward, right? But you also have buy side technologies and buy side from the ad market business. So how does that necessarily work? Well, let's just start with Target. I don't know why they're on my brain lately, but they're on my brain. So Target wants to go out and they want to buy advertising. So they go into the bidder, they go into email, they go into content, and they start buying ads, right? The New York Times sells these ads, right? We push them all through the system. They also use buy-side technology like Google Marketing Platform, which is what I represent. And then they push that, they traffic their creatives and ads through the GMP into a publisher side technology. To say, for instance, our version of that is Google Ad Manager, right? So for the New York Times to actually manage before it goes to the consumer. It's very practical, incredibly simple. We are one technology. This, albeit a little bit old, is a snapshot of the landscape as it exists relatively recently, right? These are all of the players. And look at some of these. I mean, you're wedging logos in here. But this is actually from our friends over at Luma, which is something that they like to call the Lumascape, right? But this basically showcases every single player from each portion of those three parties, the marketer to the publisher to the consumer, right? How it actually transacts. Each one of these players represent a portion of the ad ecosystem, right? Of the ad technology ecosystem, better yet. Remember when I said it started in 1996 with DoubleClick, with that first ad server? Well, look at it now, right? Every one of these organizations contribute today to that global $750 billion market. Do you know what they all have in common? This. It's a cookie, in case you didn't see that. So cookies are the fundamental tracking units for most of the World Wide Web. And they have been in use since the start of the internet and have fueled and have been the foundation of this $100+ billion industry, right? The $750 billion industry. So cookies come in many forms, and they are not the only form of tracking on the web. We're going to talk a little bit about that just to kind of give you, again, a relative basis as to what we're talking about, because All of these things are impacted by what else I'm going to show you today, right? But let's clear up one aspect of the cookie before we actually go forward. So first and foremost, a cookie does not equate to an individual. I'll say it again because I have to say it all the times in my sales meetings with all these executives who've been in the digital world for so many times. A cookie does not equate to an individual. Okay, so why? Well, a cookie is a text file that is actually dropped in. It's very browser specific and it's device specific. So how does this then translate? Perfectly. Like you are in your office at home and you're hopefully jamming away at work, and then you take a break and you're looking at stuff on Target. Again, have them on the brain. Then you go and start reading articles on CNN, right? Then you start actually browsing different things in different areas of interest that you have, and then your partner, kid, spouse, best friend shows up, says, "Hey, I just need to look something up." And let's just say it's your kid. You need to look something up, Dad. Can I just quickly do something? Sure, I'll take a break. He starts jamming away, starts looking up, diorama, how to build a diorama for like a Greek war that he has for a school project. And so he starts doing that. And then your daughter comes in and she's like, "Oh, I'm going to look up Artemis." That one cookie in that one instance, through that one browser, is tracking all of it, right? There's a person in that instance. There's 3 people, right? So you have to understand is that that could be attributed to multiple people and multiple behaviors, just not a single person. So what are the other kind of common trackers out there in the world today? Well, in the digital world, again, this is not exhaustive, but it's most common, right? There's the most common ones are cookies. We talked a little bit about that. There's a mobile ad ID, right? So mobile-based technology, it actually is not usually, it is an ad ID, right? When people say, "Hey, a mobile ad ID," that means it's a mobile ad ID. What it's not, it is not a device ID, right? Something completely different. A mobile ad ID gets actually set on to the mobile device, into the operating system. It is not the actual hardware ID or anything of that matter, in which again, I'll have a list of that stuff. And then there's fingerprinting, right? And fingerprinting is actually a variety of different inputs, IP address, header requests, plugins, all of those things. And all of these are used in some form or fashion today. I'll tell you right now, Google uses a mobile ad ID with its Android platform, and then we use cookies. We do not use fingerprinting for an abundance of reasons, and this is not to say that we are better than the industry. We have principles in which we apply in terms of tracking standards, and fingerprinting is really kind of one of those that we're just not comfortable with. Again, I'll explain a little bit more to that. And it's definitely a principle and a philosophy in terms of how we approach tracking mechanisms. All right, and so the variety of cookies out there. Well, cookies come in many forms, right? You've got first party, which are set by the website that you're visiting. There's third party. Third parties are probably the most misunderstood. Third parties are like you're on the New York Times and you see a Target ad. When that Target ad renders, it sets a cookie, right? That is actually a cookie set by a third party because you're not on the first party site. Right? Plain and simple, right? And then basically what that cookie does is it's there on your browser during on that device. And then so if you go to CNN and Target's buying ads in CNN, Target will see you that you're there. And then they can do things like storyboarding, right? So they can say, "Hey, you saw this ad for 20% off. We're going to now show you an ad for 30% off. See if you actually take action, or do something to that manner." Session cookies usually they're usually used by analytics companies, right? So web analytics. So if you're familiar with Google Analytics, we set a web session cookie, and it's usually gone after you leave the web browser. Persistent ones are ones that you actually that organizations will set if you're signing into something, right? Think you're signing into your account and it actually recognizes you again. And then there's secured cookies, and that generally has to do with really sensitive data, financial, credit card transactions, that sort of thing. Mobile ad IDs, there is an Apple ad ID, right? It's basically for a user device. It allows them to track behavior across the apps. It allows them to actually provide advertising inside the apps. Google has the same thing. It's an Android advertiser ID. So it's our version of IDFA. Again, does not equal device, hardware, those types of technologies. Excuse me. All right, fingerprinting. Fingerprinting is not just, it sounds like simple, right? It's, first off, it's not a fingerprint. Secondly, it's a combination of data points and this is not an exhaustive list, but it's pretty comprehensive, include all of these things, right? The one thing about these are many times they're very opaque, so the users don't know that they're being tracked in this manner. And so it's one of the main reasons, and again, we'll get into it, about like why there are companies out there, including ours, that are just uncomfortable with the fingerprinting aspects of tracking. Plus, as you can see, or as you will see, hopefully, when we talk about kind of what is actually happening in the regulatory side, why we feel it's just not consistent with the spirit of what we're trying to accomplish as an industry. All right. So now that we have that on the table, $750 billion industry, a ridiculous amount of companies involved, consumers, publishers, agencies, advertisers, retailers, travel companies. So now we should ask, so what? So what's going on? Like redaction of cookies, why is this a big deal? Well, I'll give you the two main catalysts for this, right? And what is actually driving this challenge. So let me tell you a story first. So you're at the mall, right? And you're actually starting to walk around, and you go into Abercrombie, although in this picture it looks like it's closed, but let's just say it's open. Doors are open, actually. Maybe it's just dark. You go into Abercrombie and you start shopping around. Start looking for stuff. Saying, oh, I've got a teenage son. Maybe they want something out of here. Yeah, don't really see anything that you want. You got to go around. You go to another store. Let's just say it's Gap. You go into Gap, have a look around there. Then you feel it, right? Then you're like, huh, I feel someone's near me. And you turn around at this mall, and there's the sales guy from Abercrombie. And he's standing with you inside the store. And he's got the jacket and shoes you're looking at. And he's got this, hey, you interested? You still interested? Right? So then you're like, you try to ignore it. You leave Gap. You go to Toys R Us, shopping something for the little one. You turn around. Not only is the guy from Abercrombie there, the saleswoman from Gap's also there. And she's got the t-shirt and the pair of pants you were looking at. She's doing the same thing. And now there are two of them. And so the point being is that if that were to happen to you in real life at a shopping mall, is that acceptable? The answer is no, right? I mean, thankfully I can't get a reaction from you, but like, I hope the answer is no. It's kind of creepy. Like, I do not want someone following me store to store with things that I've actually looked at. So why do we believe that could be acceptable in the digital world? Because that's exactly what we do today. We do what we call cross-site tracking, right? We track you from site to site to site. And then what we do is there are remarketing tactics. This person was clearly interested in this, and we put it back in here. Oh, you carded that in your inbox? Well, you clearly didn't mean to leave it in there. So I'm going to show this to you anytime I'm doing advertising on a given site. And I'll pull the product stuff that was in it, right? And so there's a level of like, okay, now is it efficient? It certainly is, because let's just kind of face it, like the digital ecosystem is a lot different than the world in which we actually transact in the physical world, right? So sometimes you'll be doing something and be like, you'll be on break here and I'll be shopping, and all of a sudden I'll be like, yeah, I forgot I had to get this birthday gift. And then somebody else will come into the office and you'll start talking and totally forget about it. And sometimes it's actually a helpful reminder. Other times it's really invasive and it's just like, well, why am I seeing all this stuff? And so by and large, the industry has said, look, like we don't believe from a technology that's something we should be doing. Maybe it was appropriate like when the industry first started going, but now with the abundance, now think about how much data collection is happening in that last slide with all those companies. With the abundance of data and signals out there, it's probably not that appropriate. So we have to change, right? We have to evolve. That's the first thing, right? So people are starting to become very aware of like, oh my gosh, how much are you tracking? What are you tracking? And then why do you keep on showing it to me? Because I'm getting kind of weirded out by it. The second story. So in the last 10 years, and many of you have been probably exposed to this and have experienced it, like we have seen a significant amount and an uptick in data security breaches that result in PII, personal identifiable information, leaking into places where it probably shouldn't, right? In fact, not to scare you, it's kind of frightening, there have been 71 publicly disclosed incidents in September of 2023 alone. 71. Like, oh yeah, that's not that much. 3.8 billion compromised personal records of individuals. 3.8 billion in September alone. Right? Now, could have had like a bunch of press releases about a bunch of companies, but that's not the point, right? The point is that we've been willingly, as consumers, as students, as workers, right, employees, we've been willingly giving our information out, willingly, right? Sometimes unknowingly. But when it really hits home is that when that information gets out into the wrong people, right? Fraud. You've got deep fakes going now. So you got deep fakes with fraud. These are really scary things that have really shaken to the consumer to its core in terms of like, oh my gosh, what's actually out there about me? So these conditions have resulted basically in a more educated and knowledgeable user, right? A consumer. And people who are more aware and concerned, quite frankly, about what people are tracking or what companies are tracking about them, how they are tracking, and then how it will be used. And so people's digital trust in digital is actually in the decline. Like 81% say that in the past year, they have become more concerned with how companies are using data, how they are leveraging data. 48% of people, almost 50% of people globally have stopped buying or using a service from a company because of their privacy concerns. 50%, right? Half the population. But it's also balanced because they're knowledgeable. Their expectations don't change, right? And if you think about your own behaviors, like people also expect personalization is standard. It is table stakes. Like I expect brands to offer me highly personalized services. And so the interesting thing here is that when we did more research, we found that actually people are more willing to share information to personalize their experiences and interactions with brands, so long as there's kind of a, when it's done in a privacy and in a responsible way, when they feel comfortable. So that has to do a lot with kind of what's disclosed and what they know about it. But most importantly, it has to do with this concept of value exchange, right? Do I value your brand? Like there are some brands I'm more than willing to give my information to, right? I'm an American Airlines frequent flyer, right? That is the only airline I will fly for the most part. But they have all of the information on me. They know which hotels I stay in. They know what other loyalty programs I'm in. They've got all of that personal information, all of that adjacent information. But because I do that, I get points, right? I get loyalty. There's loyalty, there's status, there's things that actually I get as a result of that value exchange. This is actually more prevalent among millennials and Gen Zers. But as a result of the newly acquired knowledge, consumers also have that higher level of expectations, right? So not only are they worried about sharing their personal information, they actually want to know now. They want to know that their personal data is actually secure and private. They want to be confident that it's not going to be abused. And most importantly, they want control. They want to be like, oh, enough is enough. Show me what you got on me. Or I don't want any more part of this. I want out. But again, back to that original point, about 3/4 of the population say that they only want to see ads that are relevant and useful. So here's the first conundrum of our industry, which is like, holy cow, we're going to limit signals and we're going to increase controls for consumers, but we have higher expectations on what they see and how they see it. So of course, the industry it pivots, right? And I snap my fingers, and that was really inappropriate because we don't pivot that quickly. We take some time to do it. But as this research actually starts to mount and we start to see that change in consumer sentiment, like the industry has to pivot, right? And so this is kind of the crux of where we are today. And so we've seen it pivot in two different ways. We've seen it pivot in the regulatory environment, right? And so countries and regions are adopting personal data and privacy regulations, making it unlawful to do certain things, right? Sometimes they're classifying you, sometimes they're classifying your company in terms of how you transact. But there's this whole thing. What you should know about the regulatory changes is that there's an accountability, and that accountability is actually money, right? Like you read about in the papers all day. Companies are being fined billions of dollars when they violate these policies or when it's believed that they are violating these policies. Then there's, on the other side of it, technology changes in which we're trying to balance, right? So there's increased restrictions on what data is collected. So as an advertiser, you may be like, I'm going to cookie this person as soon as I see them on New York Times. But for instance, if you're using Chrome's browser, 2024, you can't do that, right? Because we block it. If you use Safari, they've been blocking it for the last year and a half, 2 years. So they don't allow for that. And so now you're dealing with a loss of signal at the technological level. So what you see here is a timeline of this progression, right? And a progression of these changes, right? With technology changes being represented at the bottom and the regulatory changes being displayed at the top. So, the first one is Apple's ITP, right? It's basically Safari redaction of cookie tracking. And it came in many different forms, right? They classified certain assets and certain cookies as being not privacy safe, and so the browser, when you go into Safari, it would actually begin blocking those cookies, so you could not set them on your device or in the browser. And it went through several iterations of that, and you can see that Mozilla followed suit. Microsoft Edge was shortly after that. Chrome then began its announcement of kind of more of a privacy safe and privacy durable future with what it was doing, so on and so forth. On the top, you see the regulatory changes. So you have GDPR, right? GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, is an EU motion that actually came online in May of 2018, right? It's governed by about 7 principles. It's like purpose and limitation, data minimalization, accuracy, storage, integrity and confidentiality, accountability. But generally, the GDPR, it regulates data. And so you don't have to learn all the principles, but basically around the EU, it's actually categorizing types of data, how it can move, what it can contain, how long it can live there, and if it can move between entities, right? And so the other one that has actually been pretty, very prevalent in the news is the CCPA, which is the California Consumer Privacy Act. And that is different from the GDPR because it is not a data regulation. It is actually a privacy act geared to protect consumers, right? And so they are different shades of the same thing, because obviously consumers are at the heart of the GDPR principles. And California privacy then also restricts certain ways of which you can market to California-based residents. Basically speaking, you've got multiple entities kind of at work here, and then you've got Brazil's obviously towards the end releasing theirs, and basically there went the domino board, right? And so since then, we have seen regulatory action in almost every part of the world, right? They're around these themes: transparency, controls, consent, data localization. Like, why would data need to move outside your country to another country? In the EU, why would it move outside this region to another region? Protecting kids and teens, protection of sensitive groups and topics, healthcare, right? Like, you cannot market to pre-existing conditions, things like that. And then personalized ad restrictions, like what data are you using to personalize ads? Everywhere in blue on this map represents current regulatory policies that have been passed and are currently in action. All right, this map looked a lot different 10 years ago. With that, in addition to, right, you've got CCPA, but like 11 states have also passed and implemented privacy laws. So with changing regulations and applications and handling of data, privacy then became, here specifically in the United States, a very localized event. So there are certain things that we have to actually restrict from a state perspective as we deal with California, as all advertising technologies do, right? Colorado, Connecticut, New Mexico, I believe. There are a bunch of states, 11, but there are, I think, another 20 that have some sort of legislation that is being written up around this. So now you've got all these disjointed things, right? One state DA will interpret this law in one way. Connecticut state DA will interpret it in a completely different way. They are not federal laws, they are local state laws. And so now you've started to see kind of how complex this is becoming. And so when you look at it, right, from a technological, so that was regulation. Now you have the technology changes, right? And the implications here. So the implications here are, basically third-party cookies are blocked by default. First-party cookies created by JavaScripts will expire in 7 days. Created by and used by a tracking domain will. So there's different levels of how and where the cookies are being generated, how they're being generated, the type of file that it is will determine when it expires, right? Companies like ours will have to get consent from users via the storage access API to set cookies and access data for widgets and things like that. That's in Safari. In Chrome is going to fade out support for third-party cookies in 2 stages. Stage 1, which is what we're having today, and this actually should say 2024 because the Pred is 2023. So we're going to do it in 2 different phases, right? And that begins actually in earnest in 2024, next year. iOS, again, asking permission to track, and then Chrome's got a bunch of different things, and these as it relates to mobile, and then this as it relates to fingerprinting, right? I will say one thing, right? Whenever you're looking at privacy, right? Whenever you're looking at tracking and measurement and things like that within the technological ad space, you basically are dealing with 2 things. You're dealing with disclosure and intent, right? It's literally first principle. Disclosure and intent. Did you disclose to the consumer or to the individual what you're doing? Hey, I'm tracking you, right? And then did you disclose your intention as to why you're going to do it and what you're going to use it for? So things like cookies, like, right, you get the pop-ups and things like that, but things like fingerprinting, right, where we don't have disclosure and intent. That in many cases in fingerprinting, it's impossible to create disclosure, much less intention. And so those are the things, when they remain opaque to the consumer, we basically push back and say, no thanks. Like at the very least, the consumer has to have the ability to opt out, to say, nope, no thanks. We want to give the consumer the ability to see everything they've tracked. Like, for instance, on a sidebar at Google has a preference center, a privacy preference center. You can look it up. And you say Google privacy preference centers, what does Google know about me? And there's a whole thing inside Google, and I forgot like the steps, but you go into your little icon, you click settings, privacy, and then you can see all of it. You can see everything that we've got, and just in terms of, hey, here's what we think you're interested in. Here's what we know about you. Here's what we're tracking, right? Here's what, and then in every single one of those instances, like you can be like, hey, you're into like sewing. You're like, no, I'm not. I'm into, unclick that. I'm into knitting. Much different, right? Maybe not that specific, but you get the idea, right? You have full control, or you can just be like, don't track me at all, and we won't, right? Still use our services. So we have preference centers now developed, as do a lot of other companies have developed, in terms of, hey, we're going to disclose everything that we're tracking about you, because we don't want you to be surprised, right? And in many cases, we will ask permission, like everyone else does. I mean, if you ever gone to Europe, holy cow! Like I went to London when the GDPR first came out, and it was like updated terms, it was massive disclosure. And so there's notice and choice, right? And these things, there are two things that you need to actually understand. And while these things are kind of jokes, right? Like, where they're not jokes, we just basically redid the names of them all. But given the accountability factor, right? Sites and companies are taking this really, really seriously, right? And so you will have seen one of these screens. Now, one thing to note about these things is that look how they're written, right? You allowing Inferno to track your activity across other companies and apps and websites. Holy cow, if you were my mother, you'd have a heart attack, right? Like, absolutely not. And you click and click and click. And so a lot of it's consumer understanding, but some of this language is absolutely required. Or you get the lovely mobile one that's the second one in there, where it's like literally giving you a bunch of legal disclosures, which is the right thing to do. It's just not a great consumer experience, right? So just keep in mind, like as we are navigating ourselves, and by the way, spoiler alert, like I don't have answers for all of these things, right? But these are the things that we're currently navigating, because the unknown is out there. This is in fact coming. Safari's already done this, so we've lost, depending on which browser you use, you could lose up to like 50 to 60% of your tracking capabilities if you're if you market to a heavy Safari or Apple demographic, right? But like as people start to fumble with this is kind of what you're seeing. People are they're trying to kind of be compliant, and they're trying to be compliant right away because this is meaningful, right? There are accountability measures that are being implemented and levied on a lot of these companies. All right, making it more confusing, right, is that now you also have user level tracking, and people and technologies, right, are taking all different approaches like us, right? Because again, this hopefully illustrates like the waters are so muddy, and everyone and every different company is making different bets, right, in terms of what they believe. And all those bets are generally driven by principles. What are their first party principles, right? First, notice and choice, disclosure and intent. First party principles. But like some browsers like Safari, they're blocking all these identifier unilaterally by default. There's some exceptions, but they're very rare and they're very specific. Some are building alternative ID solutions, right? And so what does that mean? Well, that means like, things like unified ID out there in the market. It is basically recreating a cookie in just a different way, with the ability to track you from website to website to website. Again, if you recall that example I gave with you being in the mall and being followed around by the dude from Abercrombie and the saleswoman from Gap, and probably, the 17-year-old clerk from Toys R Us after you left there, it's really not in the spirit of what the regulations and what the consumer sentiment has been telling us. So we're not really down with kind of a unified ID. But again, we don't know. We don't know kind of eventually how it will all play out. But we are making our own bets. One of those bets, as an example, is something like a clean room, right? Where you are allowing data that has been procured in lawful and regulatory compliant ways to be actually examined and analyzed on a very aggregated level with no user information, so that you can get trending. This is actually something that the market has been doing all its life. Like when you think of TV and radio, like they're pretty good at judging audiences, right? And so you can actually get general demographic data. Why do we think that this is important on an aggregate level versus a smaller ID level? Because you don't generally market to an individual ID. Like if I'm Target, Walmart, if I'm any one of these advertisers or institutions going to their student, it's not just to the individual students. It's generally like a grouping, like students who do this or consumers who do this, right? You're basically creating groups, cohorts. And so we think that privacy-centric environments like that with modeling capabilities, using, of course, it's a technology presentation, so I have to say AI, because AI is always in there, right? But when you think about things like AI is really good at things like large data files of information and then extrapolating out kind of, hey, here are the trends, here are the anomalies, here are kind of some insights out of there, right? And using that and using machine learning models to figure out how that model evolves over time. Like those are actually really cool things that we think are going to be very relevant in the future. And building, privacy preserving technologies like Meta, right? Like Facebook is a great example of this, and they're developing their own portfolio of privacy technologies to be able to go out and then preserve kind of advertising. Lest we forget the other group in here, which are the advertisers, right? And so, they're losing critical data on a regular basis. And so, as you look at this erosion of trust with the regulatory changes and the browser changes, about 35% of their traffic on average is not measured using, due to things like users denying consent, cookies being blocked. And so, that's more than 50% on the consented traffic is through cookie blocking browsers. It doesn't allow for like that type of data capture. Furthermore, it's actually artificial things like CPAs because you're not getting that measurement back in the system. So now your CPA is so much higher because instead of saying, hey, I got 9 out of 10 conversions, you're saying I got 2 because of the blocking methodologies. We having fun yet? Yeah? This is where we are today. It is messy. It is really, really messy. But it is fun, right? Like I do smile because let me ask you this. How often in your career do you get to reinvent the very industry in which you started in? Because that's what we're doing today. That's what all of these companies are doing. They have to reinvent themselves. They have to change the architecture, right? But we have to bring people along on this journey. $750 billion is sitting out there, right? It is an economic engine for all of these countries. And so it's on us to be like, look, these are the rules of the game. Like what I often tell my sales team is we play the cards that we're dealt. Don't wonder about the ace that we could get or the queen. We play the hand we have. This is the hand. So we have to play it. So there are things that you can do, right? So first and foremost, like knowledge, right? Like first off, invest the time and energy and determine whether your organization or institution falls, where it falls and relates as it relates to data and examine that through both the lens of technology and regulatory changes, right? What are the principles that you apply when you collect data and actions? I talked about first principles, right? Do you know what data you're collecting and then how it's actually regulated? What data you could be collecting, right? Embrace AI. That's an easy one. Again, wouldn't be a technology meaning unless I said something with those two words, two letters in it. But AI. So once you've confirmed your data assets are clean and durable, move forward and begin to actually embrace the AI element. Figure out how you can actually be AI ready. Data elements in a modeled world is what AI does best. And once you have that, then you experiment, right? Test. We are in a weird time right now. We're in a time where cookies are still here. So you can actually test with a control group and say, what does my performance look like from here to there? From an identity world to a modeled world. What does this look like? Partnerships like with Carnegie. Find partners. Partners have actually driven this industry forward to where it is today, right? Partners are what made up that huge, $700 billion industry. So leverage partners. They can give you knowledge at scale. They can give you efficiency at scale that you wouldn't otherwise get, right? So use them as a resource because they are a valuable one. And then do some research on your value exchange with your students through your institutions. What is the value exchange? Should we update it? Should we refresh it? What else can we potentially give so we can get? It will be important, right? But if the value exchange is there, that then creates that relationship between you and your students or your consumers or your users or what have you. Lastly, from a cultural perspective, because this always comes up, right? Like you have to develop culture. You have to foster a culture. So first off, cultivate curiosity, prioritize comfort with experimenting, enable people to see failures, enable people to fail, right? You want to learn. There is no right way. I just showed you, like everyone's testing everything right now. The entire industry is in motion. Insist though that data trumps opinions. I got a gut feeling about this. Doesn't work, right? Like the data will actually bear you in to kind of whatever truth you are looking for, right? Just make sure it's collected in a durable and safe way. Democratize experimentation. This should not be left to one division or one individual. You should encourage a community of experimentation and then embrace different leadership models, right? Like one of empowerment is the one that works the best because you'll be able to actually quadruple your efforts in terms of what you learn out there in the market. All right, with that, again, Steve Yap, I hope you all learned something. I hope you enjoyed it. But yes, I think we're moving on to questions.
Yeah,
And how much
we
time
are.
we have? Oh, sorry.
You're doing absolutely fine. We have questions, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure.
Thank you. That was an awesome session. So the first question is, how can we target under 18-year-old web users when most new privacy acts blocks us from our primary audience as colleges and universities?
Yeah, so there are actually, because those regulations and they're getting tighter, not not less restringent or not less stringent. You should actually go to those to the experts who actually know the most about the under 18 marketing, right? Because there are different classifications of age groups in terms of who you can market with. There obviously are minors, there are juveniles, there are kids. Those all carry, and it depends where you're talking about them and what you're doing, right? So generalized information is fine, especially as it pertains to education. Great example, right? Hey, send me some information on your institution. Yeah, that's obviously well within your right. That become part of the database. They've opted in, but you should really kind of do again that knowledge-based training, right? Like as Google, just in full disclaimer, like we don't advise, right? We can't advise on the interpretations of these things, and so giving you actual steps in terms of like you need to do these things becomes rather difficult, right? Because everyone has to interpret them and their level of risk, more importantly, as it pertains to what they're doing. So what I can tell you though and advise you on is that really there are institutions out there, and there are technology organizations and companies that actually do specialize in things like that, right? Like we have a vertical structure, and so those teams are really adept at being like, here's based on what we have, what we're able to do, right? Again, you think of things like pharma, we take the most conservative stance on pharma. Other people are like, oh, we can do these things on these different levels of prescription drugs, right? It definitely is all subject to interpretation, which makes it that much more cloudy. And I'm sorry, I can't help you further on that.
Yeah, no, it's a challenging topic and one that we've definitely discovered. There's a lot of nuance to it. So thank you
Yeah.
for the question, Brian,
And I mean,
and
I
that.
see, you probably see that every day, Jamie, right? Like
Mhm.
that's the whole market that you're in.
Yeah. And then there was another question. So you had given some stats around the percentage of web traffic that would be affected by the opt-out privacy type
Yeah.
rules and regulations. Do you have a sense of like the different types of populations and the percent that are going to opt out? So obviously under 18, 18 to 24, older audiences. Like, are some more likely to opt out than others?
Yeah, so the opt out rates are actually climbing, and they're climbing for the younger demographics mostly, right? Because they tend to be the more informed ones, right? So when you're looking at, especially the segment from like 18 on up, right? 18 to like 20s, I would say, late 20s. That tends to be kind of the more knowledgeable segment. They were born and bred of the world that we're in, so they're very knowledgeable versus like the segment like my mom who doesn't know what the hell's happening out there, unfortunately, because it's not an area that she's familiar with. In terms of the browsers, there is general information on the browsers, and again, I think it's when Chrome begins to redact as well, you've got Chrome, Microsoft, Safari, and Firefox. You're looking about 80 to 90%, probably 90, mid 90s of total loss of signal on that third party side,
Yeah.
right? So but the interesting thing though is that like in a lot of the examples I was giving in terms of testing, like what a lot of people who are in the advertising digital world don't know or don't really realize is that they've been doing modeled things for over 2 years, right? Safari's been blocking these cookies for a while. So 30%, let's just say 30% on average is your Safari traffic. And those have been modeled conversions the entire time. So it's just a lot of it's getting the industry comfortable with it.
Yeah. No, I really appreciate that. I think that was all of our questions. Of course, if there are others after the session or as you're viewing this recording later, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. But an enormous thank you to you, Stephen. Thank you for being here and presenting. It was such great content. For those that are still with us, if you need any help throughout the conference or if you have questions, go ahead and email us at marketing@carnegiehighered.com, or you can message us here in the Whova app. If you go back to the agenda, you can take a look and see the remaining sessions that are happening starting in a couple of minutes. Is going to be our next session, Advancements, Top 5 Trends and the Implications for Your Institution by JGA Council, and then a number of other sessions the rest of today, tomorrow, and Thursday. But thank you all so much for being here and enjoy the rest of the connection. We appreciate your time.